The Church and the Steamboat. They retraced their steps to the rotunda. Mr. Miller quizzed Stephen on the names of everything they passed and made him go in front to show the way. It reminded Stephen of walking in the woods at night, but no nighttime forest was ever as dark as this, and no forest was ever so quiet. All he could hear was the sound of their breathing and the scuff of their footsteps on the dusty floor. By now his eyes had adjusted to the low light. He could see his surroundings much better. This passage ends pretty soon after the little bat room, he recited. Back up here is the rotunda. He led the way with his lantern. Stephen was more fascinated by this cave every minute. It was unlike any other place he had ever known, and his master wanted him to learn all about it. He would be happy to oblige. He thought of the long summer coming when the field slaves would have to toil outside even in the hottest days. In the eastern part of Kentucky, hundreds of workers sweated in the hemp fields. Hemp is a plant used to make rope and a rough cloth in which the southern plantation owners wrapped their bales of cotton. It was the most important crop in Kentucky. Then Stephen thought about himself. His mother always said that God had blessed him with a strong body and a quick mind. White people seemed to look on him with favor. He could have been a carriage driver or a house slave. House slaves mixed with the white masters much more than the field slaves did. That meant they wore better clothing, got better food, and usually had better places to sleep. But now Stephen had no interest in being a house slave. He felt very lucky to be right where he was. He promised himself that he would become the best guide Mammoth Cave had ever known. Back in the rotunda, their little fire was burning down. Archibald Miller stamped it out and led the way across the huge room into another high passageway. This is what we call the Grand Gallery, he said. On the left, here are the cliffs of Kentucky. They're named after the rocky cliffs along the Ohio River. Now, look where I'm pointing. See that hole up there? Stephen had to look hard before he located the gap high up under the cave roof. Mr. Miller said, "You can get through there and climb down the other side, but it's dangerous. Lots of huge rocks, and half of them loose, just lying on each other in a huge pile." They moved straight ahead down a tall, wide tunnel. Stephen understood why it had been named the Grand Gallery. A gallery is a tall, wide passageway. They walked for quite a while. Then suddenly the tunnel widened into a very large room. Along one wall were rough wooden benches made from split logs. Mr. Miller gestured to Stephen to sit down on one of the logs. Then he held out his hand. "Give me your lantern," he ordered. Stephen obeyed. Miller took it and began to walk away. What was happening? Was he going to leave Stephen in the dark? It seemed as though they had been exploring the cave for hours. Stephen could not possibly find his way back alone. But there was no need for him to worry. As Stephen watched, Mr. Miller climbed up the steep, rocky side of the chamber. He pulled himself onto a ledge and stood up. Now Stephen could see that someone had built a wooden pulpit up there. It looked just like the one inside the church near Mr. Gorin's house, only not as shiny. Mr. Miller got behind the pulpit. He flapped his elbows and put his hands on his shirt front just like a preacher. Stephen grinned. Mr. Miller leaned forward to gaze down at Stephen. "In the old days," he said, "there was a preacher who didn't have his own church. Or maybe he did have a church, but he couldn't keep people coming back more than 2 Sundays in a row. Probably it was because his sermons lasted all day long. He lit his pipe, and Stephen caught the strong smell of tobacco. Miller went back to his story. So he had the bright idea of holding some church services in the cave. First he preached to the slave miners who were working way down here. Then he invited folks to join him on a cave tour, ending with a sermon here in the church. When he got them here, he had them sit down comfortably, collected all their lanterns, and proceeded to preach at them for the next 4 hours. Stephen guessed the ending of the story, and they couldn't leave because they couldn't find their way out. Mr. Stephen nodded with approval. Mr. Miller nodded with approval. He climbed down and gave Stephen's lantern back to him. Stephen was certainly glad that he didn't have to find his own way out. He had no doubt that he could learn these trails, but it was only his first day. They walked on. This time Stephen spotted something up ahead. It was a wooden ladder, tall but not very strong looking, leaning against the right-hand wall. At the top was darkness. "There's a big wide hole up there," said Archibald Miller. "Go on, climb up." Stephen did as he was told. The ladder was sturdier than it had looked, but he was happy to reach the top and climb off onto a wide shelf of rock. The floor seemed a long way down. Miller came up the ladder too. He pointed to the entrance. "This is called the Haunted Chambers," he told Stephen. "When you get up here, set your lantern so that it lights up the ledge. Then go back down and help the customers. Tell them to wait right here until everyone is together." "Can ladies climb that ladder, Mr. Miller?" "Most of them choose not to. If you have a lady on the tour, then you either skip this part or ask if she would rather wait below. Never leave her alone, of course. Allow her to stay behind, only if others will wait with her. Leave their lanterns with them, and don't take too long away. Now, look over there." Miller pointed straight across the passageway. Dimly, Stephen could see another opening, about as wide as the one that led into the haunted chambers. It was directly across from them at the same height. "It looks as though this tunnel used to continue on that side, doesn't it?" Miller said. "We investigated that hole, but it chokes up with sand pretty close to the entrance, and there's no way to get through." Again, Stephen had the feeling that there was much more of Mammoth Cave waiting to be explored. The cavern seemed riddled with holes, tunnels up high, pits down low, odd little nooks and crannies everywhere. Who could say how big Mammoth Cave really was? Miller was talking. "Let your customers rest a little after the ladder climb. While they're doing that, you can tell them how the haunted chambers got its name." Stephen knew another story was coming. He made himself comfortable on the smooth floor. "I was telling you about the miners," Miller said. "During the War of 1812, the British Navy blockaded our coastline. Our soldiers were running out of gunpowder because no supply ship could reach Washington, but the man who owned Mammoth discovered that the cave was full of saltpeter. That's the peter dirt I was telling you about. If you wash down the dirt and mix it with sulfur and charcoal, you get gunpowder. My daddy was in charge of the mining operation. He had 70 men digging in here. There were oxen to pull the carts full of dirt, pipes to bring water from the entrance to wash it down, everything they needed. A lot of work went on right down there." He pointed downward. Stephen could see some old wooden vats. Sticking out of them were wooden pipes leading back toward the cave entrance. The workers were all slaves, Miller went on. One day there was a new man on his job. The overseer asked for somebody to go back into the salts room, where there was a lot of good peter dirt. And although this fellow had been back there only once before, he put up his hand. Mr. Miller pointed into the haunted chambers. "The salts room is this way. Come on." Stephen stood up and followed him. The passage ran straight ahead. The fellow knew there was no branch-offs on the way, so he thought he would be fine, Miller went on. Sure enough, he reached the right place, dug a couple of bags of dirt, and loaded them up to come back to the Grand Gallery. But somewhere along the way, he decided the return trip was taking too long. He got it into his head that he'd taken a wrong turn, even though there aren't any wrong turns to take, as you can see. Miller laughed and shook his head. Stephen didn't think the story was funny. The cave was a strange and peculiar place. Surely a person who had been inside only once before could become confused. Miller was still chuckling. The silly fellow dropped his bags and started darting forward, then back again, trying to figure out which way to go. Finally, he tripped over a stone and dropped his lantern, and there he was in the dark. Can you imagine? Stephen felt sorry for the long-ago slave. Miller said, "In the meantime, the other fellows are sitting down to their dinner." When they suddenly realize that he never came back, they decide to put together a search party. But by the time they come upon the lost man, he's completely lost his wits. When he sees them coming, he starts screaming about devils and demons and starts running. They can't catch up with him until he trips over a rock again and falls flat on his face. He told them later he was so scared that he thought he'd been cast into the devil's own region down below. And that's why they call these the haunted chambers, Stephen concluded. And still, he didn't see anything funny about the story. He would remember the tale and would repeat it to visitors, but he wouldn't laugh like Mr. Miller had when he did so. Miller showed Stephen other interesting features of the haunted chambers. Here, Stephen saw his first stalactites. Miller had him repeat the word several times to make sure he pronounced it stalactites. The stalactites were rock formations that hung down from the roof of the passageway. In other places, the formations grew up from the floor. When they grow upward, we call them stalagmites. Miller smoothed his hand along one tall growth. You can remember which one is which because stalagmite has the g in it like ground. It's the one that grows up from the ground. Stalagmite, Stephen repeated to himself. Stalactite. What interesting words, he thought. Interesting words for interesting things. This passageway was full of the strange growths. In some places, a stalagmite and a stalactite had joined in the middle to form a single column from roof to floor. Many were blackened by the candle smoke of visitors who had come here before. These formations looked almost like the trunks of trees, if trees were made out of rock.